everybody. I'm Joanna Massey-Lalikas. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. We're excited to have you all here with us today for this special talk. And I'm joined in the room by David Michaud. He'll be here to help answer any questions from our Zoom audience and any technical assistance questions that come up with Zoom. And we have folks tuning in and with us from all across North Carolina, and also some special guests from Virginia and Texas. So excited to have everybody here with us today. So we have a really special guest here today that it's my pleasure to introduce. And I also want to start before I introduce her and let her know that let you all know that Kat will be taking questions throughout the lecture. So if you see a plant on the screen, you have a specific question for Kat about it. In the audience, I'll ask you to raise your hand. I'll come around with my microphones to capture your questions so the folks on the Zoom audience can hear it. And for folks on Zoom, if you'll type your question into the Q&A function, and David will support getting your question out to Kat. So with that, I'll introduce Kat, our special guest. Kat Barr spent 30 years in diagnostic, toxicology, and quality assurance at the Texas A&M Veterinary Medical Diagnostic Lab, working both in College Station and Amarillo. Building on her early interest in folk and herbal medicine as a Girl Scout growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, she enthusiastically studied the toxic native plants of the South Central and Southwestern U.S. and their effects on grazing livestock, as well as effects of house, garden, and landscape plants on various pet species. She earned a Bachelor's of Science in Biochemistry and Molecular Biology with a minor in Analytical Chemistry at Centre College of Kentucky in 1986, and worked as a technician for 5 years in various labs and completed a PhD in toxicology at Texas A&M University in 1996 while working at TVMDL. She's been a diplomat of the American Board of Toxicology since 2000, with successful recertifications every 5 years since then. Kat recently retired to work part-time as the Diagnostic Toxicologist at the North Carolina Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory System based in Raleigh. It doesn't really sound like retirement.
No, not much.
She's currently pursuing an advanced certificate in native plants with us here at the North Carolina Botanical Garden, and we're really grateful to have Kat with us today. Please join me in welcoming Kat.
Thank you, Joanna. Great. Thanks for that introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I've done toxicology for a long time, and plants are my favorite part of it. So that's kind of where we're at today. A lot of the things that we have in our yards or even in flower arrangements that come to the house, maybe we're lucky to get those, might be toxic to the pets that we have in the house. And if we don't know about those things, we might be putting those animals at risk. And since we're their caretakers, it's kind of our responsibility to know what we're looking at as far as what they might be exposed to. So that's kind of the point of today's presentation. I want to start out with some statistics. Pet Poison Helpline is one of the call centers that takes poison control calls for veterinarians across the country. And so I went in and looked at their statistics on trends for North Carolina specifically. Most of the poisonings they get calls about happen in dogs, about 91%, about 8% in cats. These other species, birds, exotics, and equine, are the other animals they service. That doesn't mean that livestock animals don't get poisoned by plants. It just means that they don't serve those veterinarians. And then I wanted to look at the statistics on the top 20 things that they get calls about. And if you look at this, 30% of the calls that go to the helpline are about toxins of plant origin. So grapes and raisins in dogs, marijuana, onions and garlic are high on the list. Lilies, which we'll talk about pretty quick here, and then mushrooms are some of the things that top the list of things veterinarians call them about to get help with. So we're going to look at that list and then go with their top plants that they get calls from. okay, plants don't call them. Anyway, they get calls about animals that have gotten into these plants, at least potentially. So they have these statistics available to veterinarians on their website. And so Asiatic lilies are the highest call volume that they get. And one of the things you can see here is they're toxic primarily to cats. Okay, it's got a red emblem by it, which means it's a deadly toxin. So dogs, they get calls about, but lilies don't bother dogs a whole lot. They might throw up. If you look at the map on the right, you can see places that they get the majority of their calls from. So there are polka dots there, I promise. They got smaller as I made the map bigger. I don't understand that, but it was not my favorite. Another plant that we have in abundance here in North Carolina are the azaleas and rhododendrons. And those, if you notice their statistics, 78% of the calls they get are about dogs. So it's usually the dogs that get into those. And the cats only about 20%. So it varies by species. These are a little less red as far as the emblem they've got. So they're not as deadly a toxin. And so that's one of the things that they list here. If you notice under that orange arrow there, there are various different colors of emblem there. So a lot of the plants they get calls about are not deadly toxic plants. So we'll talk about some really bad ones, but we'll also talk about some that are toxic, but you don't need to get in a big hurry to go to the vet about, okay? We'll try to make some distinctions there. So a couple things about toxicology, first of all. There's this old guy from like 1500s named Paracelsus, and he came up with this rule that we follow in toxicology. It's the dose that makes the poison. So just because something is poisonous doesn't mean it's going to kill you. It all depends on, number one, how much of it you ingest, and number two, how big you are. Okay, so it's a body weight based thing. So you always have to remember that when we're talking about these plants. The smaller the animal, the higher the chance of toxicity for most of them. And sometimes species matters. Not everything metabolizes things the same way humans do. And dogs and cats are slightly different. So cats are much more different from us than the dogs are. So you just have to keep in mind some of the sensitivities are different in the different species. So for example, if a cat licks a bowl of French onion soup after the owner's finished with it, they might be okay. If they get to eat the whole thing because the owner went to get the package off the porch and forgot about their dinner, they might die from it because cats are that sensitive to that little difference in onions. Now, French onion soup is pretty high onion content, gotta say. Now, cats are twice as sensitive as dogs to onions and garlic. And that has to do with how many sulfhydryl groups are in their hemoglobin, which we're not going to get that deep into the woods today. I'm just saying. But there are some very minute little differences between the species that make a difference like that and how they can be affected by some of the toxins. So one of the things that animals typically do when they eat any kind of plant, okay, animals, carnivores, things that normally eat kibble or meat type things, they'll eat a plant and they vomit. Some of them do it for fun, I think, but they'll go nibble a bunch of things. Now, vomiting is a form of decontamination, right? Because you're removing the source of whatever might be in what you vomited up from your body, so your body can't absorb it. So vomiting is a good thing. That's a decontamination ploy. So the trouble with plants start when, number one, it's toxic to start with, and then they get a dose that's toxic to their body size. They don't vomit it effectively. Some plants affect systems other than the GI tract. So if something affects the brain or the kidneys or the liver, that's a whole nother side of effects that might be going on. If it's really toxic, that could be a big problem if they only eat a little bit of it. So the main thing that we're going to try to know today is to recognize things that are toxic so we can just know what we need to be aware of. when our animals are running around. This is Skitter here. She looks at me very accusingly frequently. And so it's our responsibility to take care of our critters. My least favorite drop dead plant is Oleander. And it's not real prevalent in central North Carolina, but it's very common along the coast and all throughout the South, particularly along the coast, and then up the West Coast. It's used as an ornamental plant. It's used in highway right-of-ways because it's pretty and it grows with almost no care, and it will stop your heart. It's not a good deal. It has cardiac glycosides and glycosidic cardenolides in it that bind the sodium potassium ATPase in cardiac muscle. And so it messes with conduction. It messes with the heart muscle livelihood. It kind of disrupts membranes, and that's a really bad thing. There's a high concentration of these cardenolides in the plant, and that's another problem. They're throughout the whole plant. And so every part of it is going to be toxic. Got all kinds of pretty colors. The toxins don't go anywhere when the plant dries. So even the dead plant is toxic. And so one of the places where we get into trouble is that the plant leavings get trimmed and then thrown over a fence into a yard. This is typically a large animal thing. I do a lot of large animal work. But if somebody kindly trims the bushes and put the trimming over for those nice herbivore animals, and the cows will eat it and they can die as well. So if you think about the body weight difference between a cow and a dog, it's very large. The plant is kind of stinky when it's green, but as it dries, it becomes less odoriferous, but it's just as toxic. So if the plants are dying for the winter and throwing their leaves into your yard, you need to be aware of where the oleanders are in your area so that you can keep an eye out for blowing leaves that might get there. It's a water-soluble toxin, so if someone cuts oleander and puts it in a vase, they need to be very careful about where they throw the water out because the toxin goes into the water. So just happy things to think about. We won't talk about one that's quite that bad after this. Lilies and daylilies are toxic almost exclusively to cats. And they're going to be very irretrievable once a cat gets into a lily. These are the beautiful ones that come in bouquets from the florist. There are daylilies. So both the lilium and the hemerocallis cause this problem. This is Odie Mae. She's my daughter's cat, and she is a counter surfer. And we've had to educate friends of hers not to send her arrangements with lilies in them because Odie will go eat them. So depression, lack of appetite are the first things you see in a cat. And then by 12 hours, they start to show signs of having renal damage. So they end up edematous, they have fluid throughout the body, and their kidneys fail. And they're pretty much irretrievable as soon as the BUN and creatinine in their serum starts rising. So you have to know there's lilies around and notice that your cat's not feeling right and get them to the vet quickly. So this is one where you do have to take action fast. They can be pulled through. Now that vets are aware, we didn't realize these were toxic until about 2004, and we don't know what the toxins are yet. But this is one that we can pull them through, but you got to get them to the vet pretty quickly and get them on fluids. And I don't know what else vets do because they're magic. I just know you've got to do something quick when it's a lily and a cat. Plants that are not actually lilies, because a lot of things have lily in their name. Cannas, hostas, alstroemeria, and peace lily, the sphath. I have an asterisk there because it does other things, but at least it's not a lily. Okay. One that's really tough on dogs in particular is the Sago Palm. Yes, ma'am. Wait, we've got a question. Just a sec.
So on that last slide, hostas are toxic to dogs.
No, hostas are not.
Oh, okay.
They're not lilies.
Okay.
The one I'm worried about is the peace lily down at the bottom, which is toxic, but it's not a lilium type toxin. Is that better? Okay. Okay. Sago palms are very toxic to anybody that eats them, but we typically have problems with dogs. They're going to be outdoor plants. Cats don't like those really pokey, frondy things that the sago palm has. These are very stiff if you've ever run across one. I've noticed there are a lot of them in the hardware stores, garden centers around here. People apparently like to have them inside. I don't know. In Texas, we had them all over the place, and they are very toxic, especially dogs seem to get into them. If they chew up one of these seeds, or if they chew up one of the fronds, they will end up with liver failure. And what we've got going on is glycosides of methylazoxymethanol. That's what that is. And the problem with it is that it alkylates the nucleic acids as soon as it's metabolized by the liver. And so that's why a lot of the damage occurs right there in the liver. So severe liver damage, the animal is vomiting and is depressed and might go into a coma. They need to go to the vet. They have elevated liver enzymes, and this is potentially fatal. It's really hard to pull an animal through sago palm poisoning. So we had people, there was a scare in Houston some years ago, a case got into the paper. And so people were pulling sago palms out of the yards and putting them at the curb to be picked up. They were picked up, thrown over the fence into the cow pasture, and it kills cows too. So this is one that's an equal opportunity killer. The next one we've got here is the azaleas and rhododendrons. This is not as drop dead toxic, partly because these will make them vomit, and so they decontaminate partly. These are full of cyanotoxins, and those bind sodium channels in any excitable membrane. So if you think about excitable membranes, that's nerves and muscles and things like that. So anything with that kind of a membrane is going to be disrupted. There's a delay of 2 to 3 hours from the time they eat the plant material, and they salivate and throw up and act weak. Their heartbeat slows. Cyanotoxins affect the heart rate and the contractility. The heartbeat slows, and they may have respiratory depression. They may have pain, and so sometimes they'll vocalize. If there's a high dose, they can have seizures, which end up in almost paralysis, and they can die from it. So we have had this. Typically, a dog will eat a couple leaves and throw it up. And usually we don't have a problem, but occasionally they'll go to town on this. So it's good to be aware that it's a problem sometimes.
And yeah, if you don't mind, we have a question on Zoom.
Sure.
Where in the azalea is the toxin located?
The cyanotoxins are throughout the plant. If I remember right, they may be highest in the plant as it's blooming. So any part of the plant is going to be toxic. Typically, we hear of the leaves being consumed. Thank you. This is kalanchoe, and it's very, yes.
So if you're outside and you're gardening and you don't have gloves on and you're working at the plant, could the animal be impacted if they came and licked your hands or anything like that?
That's a good question. With oleander, they could be, because it's throughout the plant. It is absorbable through the skin. So if you're dealing with oleander, you probably want to wear gloves. And the stuff is so high in toxicity and throughout the plant that if you've got it on you, there could be minor effects if they're licking your fingers. Don't lick your fingers if you're playing with oleander. Don't eat that. Azaleas, I would not worry about it nearly as much. They're more encapsulated in the plant material. So touching it is not going to be as detrimental as touching the oleander. I I don't remember that gray anotoxins cross the skin. I'm not absolutely sure, but I don't remember ever reading that. Good question. So this is Kalanchoe. It encompasses several different particular species. Some are called feltbush. Some are called mother of millions. It's that plant that puts babies all down the leaf and you break them off and make another plant. They are pretty prolific once you get them going. The toxin in them is a cardiotoxic bufadienolide, which is basically gonna stop cardiac conduction and cause heart failure. The whole plant is toxic, and the toxin is highest in the flowers in this one, which is kind of unusual. So within hours of ingestion, an animal might have salivation and diarrhea. And if they eat enough of the plant, by the second day, they could have cardiac arrhythmias and heart block, and severe weakness, and they can die from heart failure within 4 to 5 days. That's mostly going to be dogs, but this is a cat down here, and that's just to remind us that cats nibble things sometimes. She's nibbling thyme, so that's not going to be a toxic plant. But I asked my coworkers for pictures of their pets nibbling things so that I could sprinkle them through the presentation. So I think that's Katie. Yeah, and that's thyme. Another of our toxic plants in the area is Lantana or shrub verbena. The lantanidines deplete ATP at the mitochondrial level in the cells, and the leaves are the most toxic. They're metabolized, these toxins are metabolized in the liver, and so there's some metabolism that kind of activates them. So a lot of the activity of lantana is going to show up as liver damage. An animal that gets into lantana may be depressed and show some, just not be interested in eating. And they can have liver damage show up within 2 or 3 days. They may be icteric or have bilirubinemia, so yellowness to their mucous membranes inside the lip or the gums, and the sclera of their eyes, the whites of their eyes may get a yellow cast to it, and that's one of the ways that you know that they've gotten into something that has disrupted their liver pretty badly. This can be fatal. Usually they don't eat that much of it. It's going to usually be dogs out there gnawing, puppies gnawing are the thing we usually see this in. If you get them to the vet, they can be pulled through this. Again, vomiting is going to be the best thing they can do just to decontaminate themselves. Aloe vera has some purgative capabilities, as we know from all the health crazes that happen. So whether an animal is chewing on your aloe vera plant or gets into whatever aloe vera product you may have around, they can end up with some pretty rip-roaring diarrhea if they get too much of it. So diarrhea and cramping. If there's too much diarrhea, they can dehydrate and have an electrolyte imbalance, just like we would if we were dehydrated and sweating too much. So keep an eye on the aloe vera. That's one that either a dog or a cat can chomp on and just go to town on that nice gushy leaf once they get past the hard part. Now we've got a whole family of plants that are problematic in the same way, and they're not as heinously toxic as some of the other ones we've talked about, but we're going to put them in here because they're people's favorite house plants. They're green, they don't take a lot of care. All you need to do is water them and they grow. So the whole family of the Araceae has several species in it that all include idioblasts, which are cells that contain needles of calcium oxalate crystal that are bundled up together and kind of act like a hypodermic needle. And as soon as that cell gets wet, it takes up water. And when it swells, it pokes that needle out into whatever's against it. So if you've got an animal chewing these plants, they slobber on it and the cells get wet and they end up with calcium oxalate rhaphides or needles in their skin. And you can imagine how irritating that would be. So it's not so much a toxicity as a mechanical injury in this case, but they're just being stabbed in all their little cells when they're chewing on this stuff. So the problem is pretty minor unless you've got a really narrow esophagus and airway. And if you've got a narrow airway and esophagus and it starts swelling, you can have it swell shut. And so the reputation of these plants is that they can cause asphyxiation in something like a cat or kitten, a very small dog. Babies can get in trouble if they're chewing on this, but it's rare in human babies because people watch them closer than they do their pets. But this next couple slides, we're going to just look at some of the plants that have this same characteristic. So elephant's ear is one of them, whether it's an indoor or an outdoor, doesn't matter. Dogs, cats, anybody can chew on these. ZZ plants, which are all over Instagram, apparently, have this kind of idioblast in it with the calcium oxalate rhaphides. Other plants that are fairly popular, golden pothos. Any of the varieties of these, all the different colorations, it doesn't matter a whole lot. They've got the same characteristics. Calla lilies, Dieffenbachia, they call it dumb cane because if it swells things up, you're not going to be speaking much. And again, that's the calcium oxalate rhaphides. This peace lily, this is where we talked about the peace lily having other problems, and this is the problem that it has. And then the philodendron is probably the best known of these. And here we have Molly. She lives with a very large philodendron, and she's pretty smart about staying back from it. She's looking at it pretty balefully. So she's a smart girl. Tulips and daffodils. Now we're getting down through things that are less and less toxic, if you hadn't noticed the trend here. So tulips and daffodils don't have the same toxin, but they do pretty much the same thing. It's highest in the bulbs, and so if you're picking things up to put them in the fridge over the fall, or taking the bulbs out of the ground and you've got them all collected in one area, and an animal gets curious and starts eating them, that's when we have the worst problem. Okay, there are toxins throughout the stems and the flowers, but it's a lot more diluted. So they would have to eat a lot more plant material, and they're just not as likely to do it. They're mostly irritant. So all the tulipicides and these phenanthrene alkaloids are going to be irritants to the mucosa. So the inside of the mouth, the tongue, down the esophagus, and then into the gut. And they're mostly going to stay inside the gut, and that's where they're going to cause trouble. So vomiting, diarrhea. There is a little bit of absorption, and if they ate a whole lot of plant material, there could be central depression and renal damage, kidney damage. But these are rarely going to be fatal in our pets, but there's something to be aware of. This one surprised me. It was on the North Carolina list for the Pet Poison Helpline that pokeweed shows up for small animals. I wouldn't have expected them to go for that, but apparently they do. So pokeweed is one of those plants that it's everywhere around here. And in some places it's pretty thick. It has saponins in it, some oxalate salts, and also some steroidal glycosides that cause a lot of irritation in the gut. Some of it gets absorbed, so it can also cause liver damage in cats. But it surprised me that this was on the list for small animals. So hypersalivation and vomiting, they might have some abdominal pain, diarrhea. Like I said, cats might get some liver damage. The aqueous extract of this plant is toxic. And if you think about the way people use poke salad, you blanch it before you eat it. People eat the stuff, but you don't eat it raw. You go through at least one blanching before you eat it so that the water-soluble toxin goes out into the water and you have the plant material left. So some of these things, cats don't cook, It's just a thing with them. thumbs. So that one surprised me, but it is very relevant in this area. The last one I have on my list, wow, this is fast, is Chinaberry. And that's mostly just to make sure we think about trees in our area as well. And the Chinaberry tree is one that has these beautiful purple flowers, I think they were in May. And then they produce these berries way up in the tree, but they're all dependent. They hang down at the branch of at the junction of the branches. So right there, they're going to hang right down. Those berries are the most toxic part of the plant. And when those eventually fall, we have dogs and pigs sort of hoover those up. And that's where the most toxic part of the plant is. They can cause hypersalivation, vomiting, and then some muscle effects. So cramping and weakness, and then trembling that can progress to seizures. So the pericarp of the fruit is going to be the most toxic part of the plant. And I think that's mostly what I have. This is Finnegan, and he's not eating Chinaberry. He's eating an oak leaf, but it's very clear that he has slobbered on that oak leaf. So they do go after miscellaneous stuff and just mouth it or eat it. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Once animals eat something with a delayed onset, do they kind of get the idea and think, well, and not go back to that plant? And a kind of related question, are young pets more at risk than old pets? Like you think of babies put stuff in their mouth and then we've stopped. So
good questions. In general, the younger ones are probably going to be more inquisitive and not used to what they're seeing. So they might put more things in their mouth. But I mean, Odie Mae is 7 or 8 and she still goes and chews whatever comes in the house. So it's not necessarily an age thing. You hope they're going to grow out of the puppy stage and quit stealing your slippers and stuff like that. They don't always. So it's very individual to the animal. When you have a delayed reaction to the plant, I'm not sure they make the connection as to what set them off. Some might not. It may have to do with their own personal smarts. You can discourage them from eating that again. But again, they may have no idea what you're talking about when you say, no, don't eat that. And they don't connect it to throwing up that just now. So I don't know that they're really going to learn that much. I'd prefer that they learn not to eat any of them, but that's just me. What other questions do we have? Anything?
Say you have a 60-pound pit bull that thinks all plants are worth snacking on. How much is that dose where you're going to need to worry? Like I have a Lantana that she tries to taste every time we go by it. And sometimes the leave it cue works and sometimes it doesn't. And she gets a little bit of a leaf.
A little bit of a leaf is not going to hurt your 60-pound pit. And remember, we're talking about Paracelsus and the dose makes the poison. So that's a really good question. With a 60-pound dog, you're in pretty good shape for most plants, especially if you see her get into it and leave it works a little bit. If the oleander, I would worry about, particularly if she's left in a yard with it or a branch were to fall in the yard or something like that. I would be very worried about the oleander. Other than that, I don't think I would worry too much about plants with a 60-pound dog. Good question.
Thank you.
How do these plants impact deer and rabbits? And why I'm asking that is if you have a dog who likes to eat rabbit and deer poop, can they be impacted by what these other animals are eating?
Wow, good question. Okay. In some cases, deer and rabbits have co-evolved with some of this stuff. And so either A, they know what not to eat in their neighborhood, or B, their body has found ways of coping with it. More often, it's going to be the first one. and they learn from their fellows. So if they're animals living in the wild and they have family around, family groups, they have learned a lot of things as they're growing up from their family. Cattle do the same thing, sheep and goats, that kind of thing. It's when you move them to a place they're not used to that they tend to eat stupid things. So that part of the question we've got. Dogs and cats don't have that opportunity usually. Their parents don't know what they're eating, and they're moved across the country all the time. So they don't have the tribal knowledge, if you will. As far as coprophagia, some plants toxins go through an animal unchanged, and there's always going to be a percentage of what's in the plant that just goes through unchanged. It doesn't get absorbed in the animal that ate it, so it's not going to get metabolized to something else. Some toxins go into the animal and act without being metabolized to something else, and so they're going to go straight through anyway. An example of something that would do that is like penicillin. When we take it, it goes through our bodies unchanged. It just does its thing and then it's gone. I'm trying to think of a plant toxin that does that right now, and I'm not sure. Some of the belladonna alkaloids do that. So if you had an animal get into potato, tomato, pepper plants, those kind of things, if there are alkaloids in those, whether the animal's affected by them or not, some of those are going to be excreted in the urine unchanged. So things that come out in the feces often have been metabolized already, because a lot of metabolism happens in the liver. So if it's absorbed from the gut, it goes to the liver and gets messed with, and then it either becomes more toxic or less toxic by the metabolism that occurs there. So a lot of things that end up in the poop by way of the bile from the liver are differently toxic than they were eaten, or they're detoxified to some degree. Things that go out in the urine sometimes are not as metabolized. So it's a good question. I can't think of one that I worry about plant-wise with them eating the feces. Yes.
Yeah, we've got a couple coming in on Zoom now. Is it safe to compost these plants? And if not, is there a safe way to do so? These toxic plants.
For the most part, bacteria metabolize too. And so if we have plants going on a compost pile, they're going to be metabolized by something, because they get broken down into all the elemental stuff that we need in the soil. So the toxins in them are also going to get metabolized by something, molds, bacteria, whoever gets hold of them. They're not necessarily going to affect the microbes in the same way they do a pet. And so whether they poison the microbe or not, I flat can't tell you. I have no idea. But the plants are going to get broken down in the compost. The thing that I would caution against for sure is putting oleander on compost, because it's just the toxin's going to leach out into the water before it gets composted. So it leaches out so badly and so rapidly that it's going to just be there in the environment. Now, we've got oleanders all over the place. How do you get rid of them? That's the tricky part. Burning them gets those toxins into the smoke, and you don't want to be in the middle of that. You can bury, basically. If it's oleander, I would bury it so that you have it low enough below the soil level that any leaching into the water in the soil is going to be somewhat contained, and you know where it is. Does that help?
I think so. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
A couple more. Are you aware of any common yard or garden insecticides or fertilizers that folks call the Poison Center about?
Let's see. Watch out. I'm going to go backwards a lot. Let's see if those were on that sheet. Let's see. Antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. If you drop pills at your house, those are the other thing that they get calls about a lot. So keep an eye on your medications. Anticoagulant rodenticides are a big one as far as things that people call the Poison Control Center about. So rat baits that include things like bromadiolone, brodifacoum, difascinone, some of those active ingredients that cause bleeding by blocking the clotting factors are high on the list of things that poison centers are called about. Bromethylene is another pesticide that's used. It's been replacing the anticoagulant rodenticides in some of pesticide formulations in the last 10 years or so. And I like it less because there's no antidote to it. If you have an anticoagulant poisoning, you can give vitamin K and it brings the clotting factors back and mitigates that effect. But bromethylene causes cerebral edema, swelling in the brain, and there's no coming back from that. So it's very hard to treat bromethylene poisoning. Vitamin D3 supplement reminds me of another one, which is Quintox, or the vitamin D3 containing pesticides, and those cause tissue mineralization. That's another one that's been used to replace the anticoagulant rodenticides. So it's a vitamin, but if you have too much vitamin D, it can start you depositing calcium and phosphorus in places where it doesn't normally go. It mobilizes a lot of those in your body and changes the balance in the serum to move them around and put them in places that they don't normally go. So things like veins and arteries that are supposed to be very flexible might suddenly become somewhat mineralized, and that's not a good thing. It ends up causing renal failure because of all the tissue there that needs to be instant filtration and stuff like that. It tries to pull out the minerals, and you end up with renal failure in that case. So those are the ones on their list that I worry about. Most of the others of these are medications. It's interesting. We used to have a lot of trouble with organophosphate and carbamate toxins, the cholinesterase inhibitors, but those have been phased out for pyrethroid. So we've got much more in the way of pyrethroid pesticides out there now. Those are designed so that they don't cross the blood-brain barrier in most cases. Humans have a blood-brain barrier. Mammals have a blood-brain barrier. So there's a fence that something can't cross into your brain. But insects don't have it. So that's a case where we have an advantage if we use a pyrethroid insecticide, because it does kill the insect, but not the mammals around it. Now it's also going to kill your pollinator insect. So there's upsides and downsides to all of the pesticide things. Yes.
Thank you for that. Now I have another person on Zoom. Their dog will grab mouthfuls of grasses while they're on walks at the edges of natural wooded areas. Are there any grasses or common roadside weeds that we should be aware of?
Interesting question. With small animals, I don't worry about grasses much. First of all, they're not going to eat much of them. But secondly, most of the grasses are not going to have major toxins in them. There are exceptions. If we've got ryegrass that's got seeds on it and we've had a wet year, we might have ergot bodies on the seed head. But the odds of an animal grabbing just the seed head and getting enough of it to cause poisoning are not that great. So there are a couple grasses like that where there might be a mycotoxin problem or a fungus-produced toxin problem that we could get into. Of course, there are all kinds of weeds. A lot of the native plants around here you don't want to get hold of. But again, it's plants, and you're talking about a dog who would rather eat kibble or meat. So they're not going to get a high dose. There are plenty of plants around that we don't want them to get into. But going on a walk, I'm not as worried about them getting into our native plants as I am about them pulling a frond of that Sago Palm through the fence and chewing on it, if you're in a neighborhood. or getting hold of one of those. Let's see. The rhododendrons and azaleas are the major native in this area that I would worry about. And we covered those in our talk, so we know a little bit about those. Anything else?
I'm getting a couple of questions about specific plants and their toxicity. Do you recommend the Pet Poison Helpline as a resource for folks to do their own research on toxicity of plants, or what's the best?
There are a lot of resources. They can go to Pet Poison Helpline. They can go to the ASPCA website. Google is sometimes your friend. You have to be careful about your source if you're Googling things. You can Google the plant name. I would recommend finding out what the Latin name of the plant is, because things get called all kinds of stuff. So common names can lead you down the wrong path. But if you find the Latin name and you Google that, you can usually find things. I would trust information from places like PubMed or some of the other scholarly type sources that you might see online when you do a search, NCBI and stuff like that, rather than going with like newspaper articles or columns or opinion columns or anything like that. You're welcome to call me at the lab. I'll do whatever I can for you. My best thing is to say, I don't know, but I know somebody who does, and I will call them and get back to you. So that's definitely something we can do. Watch out, I'm going to go forward really fast. Sorry. So you can always get hold of me if you need to. And I'm willing to answer whatever questions you might have. My business card's over on the table if you want that information to go. And I can help you or send you to someone who can. I am not a veterinarian, but I have lots of friends who are. And so we work together on taking care of some of these cases. Yeah, Pet Poison Helpline is a good resource to call. They have a lot of veterinarians on staff, and they have the resources at their fingertips to answer a lot of questions, but they're going to charge you $85. So that's something else. They have to pay their staff, and they've got good folks on staff. So, but that's something to keep in mind if you're going to call them. The ASPCA Poison Control Center also charges veterinarians for consults. So we're rare. People who do diagnostic toxicology are rare. How are we doing? Specific about mushrooms. I hate mushrooms. Please don't make me talk about mushrooms. I took the mushroom. I know mushrooms grow all over the place here, and I took the mushroom class, and I still have trouble identifying anything. There are toxic mushrooms and there are not so toxic mushrooms, and part of the problem is that it's hard to identify them. And there's so many different bioforms of mushrooms. Mushrooms are tough. I have one that I can do every time, and that's just not sufficient to deal with mushrooms on a daily basis. So yeah, we have lots of mushrooms around here. There's a good variety. I will say many of the polypore mushrooms, the shelf type mushrooms, are not going to have a high toxicity. That's about the only generalization I can make about mushrooms.
What do you mean by shelf mushroom?
Oh, the shelf mushrooms, the polypores, the ones that tend to grow on wood, and they've got kind of a flat surface, and then they have a slant down that supports them like a shelf. Yeah. They don't tend to be toxic. They also tend to be pretty woody. So they're not going to be your favorite edible anyway. But.
One more question from Zoom. Since our pets are such important family members, is there any movement in the nursery industry to include dog or cat friendly tags on plants?
As far as I know, there is not, because they have to sell product. it's really our responsibility to have some idea what we're putting in front of our pets. And that's why I'm trying to get the word out, or get people some resources, or make people curious to know what they're putting in their yard, so that they know what they need to be aware that they have. I mean, some animals don't go chew on plants at all, or they'll go chew on grass, and that's the only thing they're going to touch. But it helps to have some idea what they could get exposed to in case they just ain't doing right one day. That's a veterinary term, by the way, ain't doing right, ADR on paperwork. But, you know, there are things that make them not do right, but won't kill them. And so having some idea about that is really going to be a smart pet owner.
So you were suggesting trying to get the Latin name, and I think that there are some apps where you can take, put your camera on a plant and it'll identify a plant. At least it'll do that about trees. Mm-hmm. Are there any good apps you could recommend for identifying plants?
I don't use them myself because I am challenged. But most of the classes I've been at here, people recommend iNaturalist, and I've seen it work and it's pretty good. So just by reputation only, I am a secondary witness that iNaturalist is a pretty good one. And again, you're going to have to go through some, and don't take the first result. Go through and look at several, and majority kind of rules. So if there's going to be an outlier here or there, and those are not the ones you want to be the first one to show up. So always make sure you look through several of the possibilities to make sure that it's a match. I do that even with the Latin names, because if you use images on Google, the first several will probably be right. And then as you go down a couple lines, you get stuff that that's not what you're looking at. It's just not. So you have to be careful about how you use the computer, but it's a powerful thing. So, good question.
Okay, well.
My last thing is just to thank everybody. So this is my thank you slide. I solicited pets who got into plants photos from my coworkers. And so these are donated by people at the Veterinary Diagnostic Lab. That is a thing, by the way. The veterinarians send samples from your animals to the lab to get analyzed for diseases or toxins or whatever might be wrong with them. They send us tumors to do histopathology, just like a people. So we are a full service lab, and we try to serve the veterinarians in the area. I have a lot of thanks to the North Carolina Botanical Garden, because they have let me traipse over this place, all over the place, on many occasions with my phone and take pictures, and I am grateful. And then the other place that I have to thank is the Harris Teeter on Edwards Mill Road, because they let me take pictures in their flower shop. And a lot of the pictures I didn't have of some of the stuff that comes in bouquets. So I really appreciate them for that. And then the Pet Poison Helpline for giving us the statistics we looked at the beginning of the presentation. Well, if there are no other questions, that's what I've got.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Kat. We really appreciate you coming, and thank everybody for listening in on Zoom and being here in person. For those who may not be as familiar with the North Carolina Botanical Garden, I hope you'll consider membership. It's really a priority in our funding to be able to offer such programs. So we have membership information on the way out, and David will send it to the Zoom folks. And thank you for folks who are already members of the garden. Please join me in thanking Kat Barr for being here today.
Thank y'all for having me.